everyone. And if this is your first time on an MS Views and News event, welcome. We do these events all month. We have different programs, but tonight you are joining Race, Culture, and Community While Living with Multiple Sclerosis. This is a 4-part series, and this is the second program with whose topic is the Black and African American experience while living with multiple sclerosis. And before we continue, we'd like to thank our supporters for this series and supporters of this project, Bristol Myers-Squibb, Biogen, and Novartis. Thank you. And tonight we are extremely honored to have an opportunity to have worked with Ms. Sheila Thorne, who will be sharing her expertise and sharing all of her knowledge with us tonight. And I'm going to share a little bit more with you about Sheila. Sheila Thorne, is recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in multicultural and cultural competency in healthcare delivery. Sheila has spent almost 3 decades designing health marketing, media, and health education programs for racially diverse populations with a commitment to raise awareness of the need to eliminate health disparities and distribute culturally relevant health education. And that's what we're doing here tonight. So I would like to introduce to you and welcome Ms. Sheila Thorne.
Thank you, Jennifer. It is a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak again to the MS community, patient advocates, clinicians, and industry leaders. This is an important topic. We are at a pivotal moment in healthcare in this country. COVID-19 pandemic has glaringly illuminated the inequities and inequalities in the American society. And this most definitely impacts people living with MS. First slide, Bill. From the moment the first slave stepped off the slave ship in Virginia, that began the African American experience in America over 400 years ago. That middle passage from West Africa to the Americas launched an experience that is still reverberating in America today. The slave ships had 400 to 600 people packed like sardines in a very small space of almost about 3 feet around each person, shackled with heavy iron, branded so that they wouldn't get out of line. People that were sleeping and living in their own excrement. Clearly, this beginning of the African American experience clearly has its vestiges left in society. If you got out of line, you were tossed overboard. If you were dying or dead, you were tossed overboard. Some of the slaves even jumped overboard because of the horrific conditions that they were involved in. This journey took anywhere from a few weeks to 6 months, and millions of people of African descent were on those ships in several trips in that middle passage. Once they landed in Virginia, that began the saga. But the final passage was from that ship to the plantations, where each of these people were either sold on auctions, they were brutally treated, they worked in back-breaking conditions, in exposure to all kinds of elements. Husbands and wives were separated, children were ripped from their mother's arms, and clearly that massive, forced relocation of people from Africa to the Americas has shaped the cultural identity, even to this day, of people of African heritage. Next slide, Bill. If you really want to get into the details about what that horrific experience, those several middle passages that took place, that 6,000-mile journey, I urge you to get your hands on one of these docudramas that can lead you through that story. From Roots to 12 Years a Slave to Harriet Tubman, which came out in just a few years ago. She was the slave in the South who got freedom to the North, but went back 13 times to free other slaves. Truly a hero in the African American experience, and her life, her legacy still inspires people of African descent today who are still looking for a way to get freedom, justice, and equality. Next slide. In Washington, D.C., there's an extraordinary museum. If you have the opportunity in the future to visit Washington, I urge you to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is a phenomenal testimony that chronicles the African American experience in this country. This is not just African American history or Black history, it's America's history. Next slide. Here we are in 2021. The population is burgeoning of people of color. Before the middle of this century, 1 out of every 2 Americans will be a person of color or a person of color who speaks Spanish. So now we have the consumer world and even the patient world involved that is experiencing a re-energizing, a recharging. When I was growing up, my mom couldn't find a doll that looked like me. Now you have them on the market, from Barbie to even those that are even younger, and even Ken. And look at the Band-Aids. Now you have diversity in healing. J&J issued these Band-Aids so that it would look right on anybody, no matter color, no matter whose color you are. So the populations in America are no longer minorities. They're emerging majorities or existing majorities. We have truly reached the demographic tipping point. Next slide. And look at even Hollywood. This phenomenon happened a couple of years ago. This movie, a Marvel comic book, a fictitious Black utopian Wakanda doesn't even exist. And yet it reverberated around the world. The 3rd highest grossing movie in America. Clearly, this is a showing of the demographic shifts, the seismic shifts that this world is undergoing, particularly in the Americas. Next slide. This is the Black diaspora. And the diaspora is really a group or dispersion of people to other parts of the world. And it started in Africa, the cradle of civilization. So people from there went to all parts of the world, in the Americas, in Europe, in the Middle East. Communities of the world started in Africa. Next slide. But let's get rid of some of the terminology so that we're all thinking about the same thing. This word race, nothing biological or scientific about race. It's a social construct. It's really a concept. It only has to do with physical characteristics, the color of my skin, the shape of my eyes, the texture of my hair, my body image. Nothing biological or scientific about race. It's a category of really just how humankind has decided to divide itself. This book by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, does a phenomenal overview of this term race and how it has impacted culture, race, and ethnicity. Next slide. Well, we're going to talk about Black culture today. As Jennifer said, this is the first of a series looking at people living with MS who are of African descent. Culture is shared. Culture is learned. Culture is something you pass on. It tells you what's acceptable. Your community, your family teaches you that. And this is the culture that we're going to discuss this evening. How people of color, people of African descent are living with MS. Next slide. But let's get it clear as to what we're going to talk about. There are stereotypes and there are generalizations. A stereotype is an endpoint. It's whatever you've seen in the movies or on TV or maybe have personally experienced. Unfortunately, people take those experiences, take those images, and they apply it to whole groups of people without ever really figuring out whether it applies to anyone. We don't want stereotypes. These are negative images of people of African descent. What I'm going to share with you tonight is what I've learned about valid cultural generalizations. That's a beginning point. Those are things that have been observed in these populations over long periods of time in large numbers of people. Once you have that generalization, you've got to get some more information to make sure you're accurate. Next slide. Here's what I mean. A stereotype. Charles is African American. He lives in New York City. He must live in Harlem. That's a stereotype. Valid cultural generalization. Charles is African American. He lives in New York City. Many African Americans in New York City live in Harlem. I wonder if that's where Charles lives. That's what a generalization is. Here's another one. Sue is Chinese. She never speaks up to the boss when the team has problems because Asian women are very submissive. That's a stereotype. Valid cultural generalization. Sue is Chinese. She never speaks up to the boss in team meetings. Many Chinese women have great respect for authority. I wonder if that's why Sue doesn't speak up to the boss. So you see the difference? So from here on, I'm going to share with you valid cultural generalizations. It's your job to find out what I share with you applies to people of African descent who you work and live near. Next slide. Here's the demographics of the group. Almost 48 million strong, almost 15% of the US population. Predominant group in the Southeast, next followed by the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. These groups are all, this particular group is all throughout the country, even in places like Nebraska and Omaha and Oklahoma, which you might not think have many African Americans. There are pockets of opportunity there. Is that where you live? Have you seen the neighborhoods change? More people of African descent? It's highly likely. It is now the second largest so-called minority population in this country. These are communities or people of color of African descent. Next slide. And quite frankly, race is critical to understanding the cultural identity of this population. Black people are more likely to see race as central to their identity. How often do they think about their race? Every day, all the time. Very different from Hispanic, Latinx, or white communities. It's central, it's key to understanding who we are. Our heritage, our history, our culture is extremely important to us. Next slide. So how do we see the world? We see the world through a lens of freedom, justice, and equality. That's not a surprise based on how we began our experience in America. History of struggle, discrimination. We see the world through that lens, but a strong sense of pride in our African heritage. Our forced relocation helps us to look back to see where our roots are. Strong sense of family, strong sense of community and spirituality. Black family reunions are an extraordinarily happy phenomenon in the Black community. In the summertime, mostly Black families get together. They talk about stories. Their grandparents relate how they came to this country, their struggles, overcoming those obstacles. So that demonstrates the pride in family, this child-centric attitude, fiercely protective of elderly and seniors, and children. But the question is, will all African Americans follow this pattern? Probably not, but many do. Next slide. And what do we value? What is important to us? Education, highly valued. Spirituality, key to our existence. Not necessarily religion, but certainly spirituality. Many of you may have been to a Black church. Not a very quiet, laid-back experience, but very expressive. Personal image, very important. Pride in personal appearance, looking good and making sure that you have the right presentation to others. Family ceremony, very important. Family reunions, weddings, graduations, retirements, time for family to get together, time for sharing successes, time for celebrating how you've overcome insurmountable obstacles, and relaxed time consciousness. Relationships are more important than punctuality. Next slide. Sense of self and space. I see this all the time with my friends, my colleagues, and my family. We live in two worlds. You live in the world where you are looked upon as a quote unquote minority, but you also live in your own world with your own people, people who look like you, people who come from where you come from, people who understand culture. That double consciousness can create stress and it can create friction. But please know that people of color, people of African descent, have that double consciousness, living in two different worlds, two different behaviors, two different mindsets. And formality is key. Do not assume familiarity with someone of color, someone of African heritage. You're not expected to call an elderly person, especially by their first name the first time you meet them. You have to get permission to be familiar. And that harkens back to slavery too, where Black men were called boys and Black women were called gals. That infantilizes the group. So be clear about formality first. Next slide. Communication style, very expressive. A lot of gestures, a lot of tone, a lot of body language in terms of when they speak. And sometimes that's misinterpreted as aggressive, but that's the style that's embedded in this culture because it's animated, because it clearly wants to make sure people hear and see what they want to say and what they're doing. Next slide. And let's talk about Black women, because in terms of MS, Black women have MS more than white women. So you may predominantly, if you're a patient advocate or you're a caregiver, have to see how to handle, how to work with Black women. Very independent group, very proud, resilient, courageous, strong. Half of the Black families in this country are female-headed households. That presents a challenge, not because they don't want a partner, but because of over-incarceration, because of marginalizing and emasculating Black men. Often women are left to take care of all the responsibilities. And certainly that's a societal problem. It's not a Black problem. And trendsetters. These women take the lead in fashion, in makeup, in cooking, in clothing. They are early adopters. They want to be out front and have the latest and the best for themselves and their families. Next slide. But there are some stereotypes that are still kind of the vestiges of slavery. Unfortunately, in the Hollywood scene, many times Black women are only looked at as domestics, or they're looked at as promiscuous, or like the very popular comedic show, The Diary of a Mad Black Woman, that characterizes women as always being aggressive, ill-tempered, overbearing, loud, ignorant. Those are stereotypes. Those are not the way that Black women should be portrayed, but this has sustained itself in the population. If you're a Black woman with MS, have some people assumed that you fall into that category? As caregivers and caretakers, do we dismiss those stereotypes if we're dealing with Black women with MS? I hope so. Next slide. And there's the other stereotype, the Black superwoman. Because so many of the households are female-led, these women often feel that they've got the obligation to always look strong, always be on top of everything. Suppress your feelings. Don't be vulnerable. Don't be dependent, because too many people depend upon you. And that can be daunting as well and create frustration, create depression. And you have to be strong. And that clearly is not necessarily applied to all Black women. Some, yes, but don't assume that because this woman is taking charge and taking control, that she doesn't need help. She doesn't need resources or support. And that certainly applies to Black women living with MS. Next slide. And then I thought you'd like to see this example of Serena Williams, the top athlete in the world. And she too has experiences with discrimination and being marginalized. When she was doing one of her tennis matches, people were yelling from the stands, using the N-word, calling her that she looked like a monkey. And 99% of the people in the stadium who weren't supporting her were white. What did it do to her? Notice what she said. Racial slurs used. It was loud. It was like an echo. It was so loud, I could feel it in my chest. So even this woman, as accomplished and as wealthy and as educated as she is the recipient of racial discrimination. And what did it do? It wasn't just emotional. It had a biological effect on her. So Black women living with MS, that may also be exacerbating an already challenging condition to live with. Next slide. And let's look at Black men. Clearly, Black men have been stigmatized and have been marginalized in the community. And there's a serious level of mistrust, distrust, that ethic of toughness that you have to demonstrate so that if you're devalued or emasculated, you keep on going. Sickness is often seen as a weakness. Look at the Black men on this slide. In this slide, you have a college professor, a financial counselor, a stockbroker, a musician, and a retired police officer. So you can't just determine who a person is by the way they look. Those are stereotypes. This is the actual image of a Black man. But how does a Black man with MS survive? We're going to talk to one later, and you'll find out from his own personal journey. Next slide. And obviously, this is the predominant image of Black men. Black men are portrayed as drug dealers, pimps, con artists, criminals in TV and films. If you've never had a relationship with a Black man, that might be the image you take away. That's the stereotype. Without understanding how this society has diminished and oppressed these men so that they emulate a different persona when they're in the public. So I hope that's not your image of Black men, and certainly not your image of Black men living with MS. Next slide. And what about this group, Millennials? These are the ones who are driving the digital advancement, the digital social change. This is the group that came up with Black Lives Matter. Highly misunderstood when they first came out. Clearly, they were looked upon as domestic terrorists. They were demonized. These are the ones that were taking a stand against police brutality and other injustices. Well, once people really understood and started talking to this group, they realized that this group really is in the forefront of wanting change. Maybe aggressively, maybe not articulated very well, but they were in the forefront. Now they're naming streets after them and plazas after them, and even considering giving them a Nobel Peace Prize. Black millennials are often the ones in homes of patients suffering with MS, and they're the ones that are going to be hopefully supporting you in your caregiving. Next slide. And what about food? Diet also impacts health, but these groups don't really appreciate or like synthetic Western medicine because in the days gone by, they couldn't afford the other medicines or weren't allowed in pharmacies to buy them. So they depended upon herbs. They depended upon alternative therapies. And so that understanding, not liking Western medicine and pills and needles is still in the community. They'd rather use herbs. They'd rather use something they call organic or natural. That may not be bad, but anyone living with MS should confer with their healthcare provider to see whether that's the best kind of treatment to embrace if you're living with MS. But know this, that's the tradition, that's the culture. Next slide. And what about diet? Those that were in the plantations during slavery times got the worst cuts of meat, the fattiest cuts of meat, the meats without much protein, no fresh fruit and vegetables. They made do. We all like soul food. I know I do. Every time I look at this slide, I get hungry. But that's not the diet that can necessarily put you in a good health mode. And that may not be the diet that you want to consume if you're living with MS. That may have other effects on you. But that's the tendency in this community to like that kind of food. And we have a more forgiving attitude towards larger, fuller figured women, as opposed to the so-called mainstream population. And exercise clearly is a challenge for people living with MS. And maybe women living with MS have to think about that in terms of how to live well without necessarily exacerbating their condition. Next slide. And the attitude about health, I do focus groups around the country all the time. And these are the things that I have seen. Passive acceptance of chronic disease, suffering in silence, not thinking about prevention, thinking about today, not the future. And advanced disease, once you do get into the system, which makes it very difficult for treatment. Sometimes the quality of life medications that may be available may not work as well because you've waited a long time before you get help. And an aversion, as I said, to needles and surgical procedures, a lot of myths around that. So how can we create a sense of importance and urgency around MS so that women and men of color don't wait too long? Women and men of African descent get help, access the resources that they need to live well. Next slide. This, unfortunately, is the profile. Even if you have MS, you may have other conditions as well: hypertension, diabetes, arthritis, respiratory disease, COPD. So anyone of African descent living with MS may have comorbid conditions that have to also be dealt with. That compounds the challenge of living well in terms of medication, in terms of going to providers and making sure that you're living as best as you possibly can. This profile is daunting. It's persistent and it's pervasive. Even if you have insurance, even if you're educated, it has been permeating the health system for people of African descent. We have to do something about that. And those of you who are on this webinar, I know are in the mindset to make a difference, to make a change. Next slide. And therefore, we are led to disparities. Disparities in health, differences in outcomes and prevalence and burden of disease, and disparities in health care, differences in access. But know this, it's not just with poor people, it's people in middle class who are insured who have these disparities. But why do we have them? Next slide. There are a constellation of factors that drive health disparities. It's complex, it's not simple. And again, it's not just about insurance or poverty. There are many things that are going on underneath the water that are impacting health outcomes. And that leads us to, next slide, social determinants of health. It's a better predictor of your health status and health outcomes by your zip code than by your genetic code. Economic stability. Do you have a job? Can you afford to pay for medical bills? What about your neighborhood? Do you feel safe walking in your community? Is it walkable? Are there playgrounds and parks where you might get exercise or enjoy the outside? Education. Do you understand health information? Have people made it easy for you to really understand the dynamics of your disease? That's literacy. Many in the Black community have been eliminated from getting to higher education in the way that would make them literate and educated. Food scarcity. Can you buy fresh fruit and vegetables in your neighborhood? Or are you just pushed to fast food outlets because it's expedient and because that's all that's there? Are there healthy options for you to eat? And then again, what about your social context, your social support, your community engagement? Stress kicks in big time. Race-based traumatic stress is what's being experienced by African Americans and other communities of color. And then there's the system, major barriers there. Are you underinsured? Do you have enough insurance? And what about your providers? Are they linguistically or culturally competent? And what's the quality of care? So I think you can see that these social determinants for Black men and women or young people living with MS are critical to acknowledging so that we make sure they live well and acknowledge how to address these factors. Next slide. And racism, as you can see in that slide about social determinants, that now is an element of social determinants. And it's not just racial slurs and hateful acts and hate crimes, it's power. It's power that the majority population has over me as a Black woman that could deny me a mortgage, that could prevent me from getting a good job and from access to health care solely on the basis of the way I look. Dr. Kamara Jones was one of the first clinicians in the country to connect healthcare disparities with racism. It is now documented. There is no debate. Next slide. And clearly the medical research community is now suffering under that historical abuse. Tuskegee, as the longest running human experiment in medical history, is often touted as the reason why Black people do not volunteer for clinical research. It's not the reason, it's a symbol of medical abuse. And that was one of the most egregious forms, but not necessarily the worst form. There are others, but that has remained in the community so that they're less likely to volunteer. And we've seen that with the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. Not enough people of color in those trials. And that can be serious because unless you know how these drugs work, safety profile, side effect profile, adherence issues, we can't possibly lead a quality life. Next slide. And I thought you'd like to see exactly how the people of African descent feel about culture, feel about healthcare. They're wired before they even get into the room. They think that they would get better care if they were of a different race. If you're on this webinar and you're living with MS, has this ever crossed your mind? Are they giving me the best information and the best drugs and the best options? People of color, people of African descent, as you can see in this slide, worry about that. Next slide. And then when they do get into the system, they feel they're going to be treated with disrespect. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And why are they treated with disrespect? Ability to pay, ability to speak English, or their race or ethnicity. The data continue to be the same, no matter how it's done, no matter when it's done. In fact, next slide, they did a recent survey that showed the same information. This was done just last year, a Black Health survey. Percentage of people who feel that they were treated unfairly based on their race, 70% Black. Percentage of people who thought they were treated in the past year, 20%. The numbers keep saying the same thing. So there's something else going on. There clearly is that element of lack of cultural competence, the cultural deficit that we as caregivers, providers, clinicians, and living with MS have to acknowledge. Next slide. And quite frankly, even across all measures, Black Americans feel that they fare worse than other populations. Why is that? It's a systemic, it's a structural, it's an institutional problem. But individually, we can make a difference. Next slide. And the National Pharmaceutical Council has already documented that pharmacogenetic research have uncovered significant differences in racial and ethnic categories in metabolism, clinical effectiveness, side effect profiles. So we've got to go to that patient-centered care, that personalized medicine, especially when we look at all of what impacts Black people living with MS. Next slide. And recent studies have shown that in terms of MS, there are basic differences between African Americans and the white community. Black people who are living with MS bring very unique challenges. They experience more relapses, greater disability, and require mobility assistance earlier in the disease course. So if you're living with MS and you require mobility, do you reach out for the assistance, or are you hesitant because of what the system may not have treated you well? We've got to change that. So the resources that are available are accessible to everybody. Next slide. And this recent data has shown that there is interest on the part of people of color being in clinical trials, but there are still concerns. Next slide. And some of the concerns are being demonstrated by those who have a willingness, who have an interest, and this study definitely demonstrated that. Most were white that were surveyed. There were some Blacks and Hispanics combined. Let's look at one of their findings. Next slide. Compared with white patients, Blacks were twice as likely to be concerned about being used by trial investigators. There's the ghosts of Tuskegee right there. Black patients showed a lesser willingness to agree that better treatment option came from research than did other patient groups. Wow. African Americans tended to assign greater importance to diet and exercise than did white patients. So this was a snapshot. You need to find out whether how much of this data refers or applies to the people of African descent that you live and work with. Next slide. And obviously, racism and discrimination definitely has that mistrust that's pervasive, the distrust that you can't trust communities, you can't distrust the health community to tell you the right information. Being concerned about poor quality of care. These are all of the things that are going on in the minds and the hearts of Black people living with MS. So as patients, as caregivers, as advocates, we've got to acknowledge these changes. We've got to acknowledge these concerns if we're going to make sure people live well. Next slide. And the socioeconomic factors as part of that social determinants of health, delays in diagnosis, lack of education. And quite frankly, there are four things: lack of education, information, misinformation, the trust issue, and the impact of social determinants. Those are the things that as we reach out to Black people who are living with MS that we've got to address and we've got to acknowledge, and we've got to figure out a way to bring in the partners that can help us mitigate all of those negativities that prevent one from living well with MS. Next slide. And part of the challenge is, what is a clinical trial? These communities are not hard to reach, they're hardly reached. So how have we reached out as clinicians to people that you may be treating who may be eligible for clinical trials? Do they really understand the responsibility? What is informed consent? If I don't want to be in the trial and I do sign up, can I opt out? We need that education. If that kind of information is not accessible to Black people. If it was, perhaps we would have more people willing to volunteer and be a part of the critical clinical research that can lead to better treatment regimens and even a cure. Next slide. So, living well with MS, is it possible? Absolutely. Next slide. And I want to bring in somebody, an African-American man living with MS, and interview him, because we learn a lot from patient stories, and Damian is going to help us understand what his journey has been like. Welcome, Damian.
Man, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it's so good to talk to you. You and I had a couple of conversations, and I was struck by how you have managed to live with MS. But first, tell us a little bit about you. Where were you born? Where were you raised? Where do you live now?
Yeah, I'm born and raised in New York City. I'm from Harlem, and I'm currently living in Los Angeles. And I'm an entertainment professional, so to speak. I've done about 30, 40 commercials and voiceovers in my career. And these days I make multiple sclerosis content for this channel and my own channel with over 4,500 subscribers on YouTube. No Stress MS.
Wonderful. And what do you do for a living, Damian?
This
is it. Okay.
Being an actor, I have been able to make a living in commercials. I did about 2 to 6 commercials or voiceovers a year for about 8 years.
Okay.
Until COVID adjusted everything, but that's my job.
All right, well, let's get down to it. Do you remember how you reacted the first time you were given the diagnosis that you had MS?
Well, when I got diagnosed, I couldn't really think of other Black people that have MS. It doesn't seem to be a disease that came with my race, so to speak, in some way.
Okay.
Except for Richard Pryor, and it did not end well for him.
Right.
Montel Williams, he's like a rock as far as diagnosed and then still having a good life. Other than that, that's it. You know, Annette Funicello, we know, had MS back in her day, but she doesn't really qualify. You know what I mean?
That's right. That's right. So did you know much about MS before you were diagnosed?
Other than Richard Pryor and Montel had it? Not at all.
Wow. And as a Black man, who did you tell first once you were diagnosed?
That's a very good question. I didn't really hide it from anyone, but I didn't really tell my mom until I sort of actually knew that, yes, it is confirmed that you have MS. Mm-hmm. And once I sort of started to get a handle on it, that or what I needed to be able to do, then I told my mom, because I didn't want to tell her that I had this disease and then not have any more information to follow up with. You know?
And who gave you that diagnosis? Which healthcare provider gave you the diagnosis? Physician, NP? How did that come about?
An emergency care doctor, because my symptoms were just so weird that my wife was like, "We're going to emergency care and we are not leaving until we know what's wrong with you." That doctor got an MRI ordered. And the MRI report read out, "No, this guy's totally healthy. He totally has multiple sclerosis. Get a neurologist and have him check it out."
Wow, interesting. So how did your life change?
Well, initially wanting to get the strongest therapy that I could possibly get in order to stave off the long-term effects of MS, had horrible side effects. So I'm having to balance my life and go on auditions and be a nice husband, and these flu-like symptoms. No, it's as if, it's the worst hangover you have ever had, ever, every other day. So having to find a drug that worked for me, a therapy that worked for me to help stave off my disease progression, but still did not adversely affect my quality of life. That was a major thing for me. And once I sort of found that, then I started to put together all the other pieces that make me a vibrant guy out in front in the multiple community.
Well, did anybody help you with dealing with all of those things, those changes? Where did you go for help, support, encouragement, whatever?
Well, not even to be funny, where a guy like me often goes for help, inside, because you often don't get help outside. There's not many people to turn to or to commiserate with, or to people just want to hear your story and say, "Oh, that's too bad." But then after that, they don't have any answers. So I was of course, my wife. We're family, but outside of that.
So let me ask you this: at any time in your journey, did you feel like your race prevented you from getting help or getting assistance or being dealt with in an appropriate way?
That's very interesting because my first neurologist, a Caucasian female, as we sort of went through the medicines to the disease modifying therapies, I'm sort of getting under the impression, I'm like, yo, this thing is horrible. I have to stay on this another 3 months. What is this? What's going to go on? And eventually, as I found my way to a specialist, that specialist happened to be an Asian man. And and he and I have many commonalities, the music, in neighborhoods, things like that. So once I was in his care, I knew I was getting straight information because I trust. Forget the diplomas on his wall. He feels like a man, like a guy, and so having that connection really helped to calm me down, and so I could put my best foot forward.
Interesting. So you become an advocate, you become an activist, you are immersed in the MS community, you are using your professional talents. Why are you doing that?
I use my professional talents in the multiple sclerosis community to help people feel less alone. I'm a very good and very practiced on stage, on camera. I know how to take scripts and make and breathe life into them. And as I started to breathe life into the scripts of my vlogs, it sort of became apparent that my sort of energy in this space is welcome because it helps connect people. And people say, I see myself in him. But because I'm on the internet, I'm accessible, and they email me and they text me and things like that. So that's my main way through.
Interesting. So when you need help, when something occurs with your condition that you don't quite understand or kind of puts you back, who do you go to for help?
If it's not my neurologist, I've become very good at research because I run the vlog and I have an audience that I have to work to tweak information for. So I've become very adept at where to go or how to search or how to discard information or how to sort of have my research hat on, so to speak, and really be able to pick through information. But for the most part, I drive this ship.
Well, you take charge and control of your health. And is that easy for Black people to do in this country?
Not at all. The idea of a food desert is real, and some people have never even heard of that, which is even more astounding to somebody like me. But I was born and raised in a food desert in 131st Street in Madison.
I know it well. I'm from. By the way, I'm from the boogie down Bronx, so I know you. Okay. I know who you are, brother.
You know what food deserts are. Food deserts, like there's quick service Chinese food. There's liquor stores. There's bodegas with quick grab items. There's the supermarkets that are present. All of the goods are of less quality. And if you try to go to another farther supermarket, it's the same thing. So unless you really work to leave your neighborhood, you're not going to get quality, nutritious food. It's just not the way it happens.
So you got to work harder at it when you're a Black person in terms of finding good food, healthy options, and places that you can depend upon to give you the best and the freshest. So I certainly agree and understand what you're saying. You're an amazing man, Damian, not only being a Black man in America, but being a Black man with MS. It certainly puts you in a different category. For those who may be listening, what advice or what encouragement or what words of wisdom would you give to Black people living with MS?
I would say to listen to your body as closely as you can, and try things out, even if they may seem out of your paradigm. I meditate twice a day. I do Qigong twice a day. These are things that help my wellness. They help my gait. They help my cognition. And they don't look like a pill that you would take or something that your doctor told you that you needed to do, that you're avoiding. But that's where the research comes in. And it's like, there's only but so many times I can read this practice helps with X, Y, and Z. And I have trouble with X, Y, and Z. And I know no one is telling me to do these things, but it's on me to give these things a try. So continue to research, continue to try, and know that there is more wellness out here for you than you can currently see. I know that.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you, Damian Washington. You're an inspiration, and we wish you well, and we hope you continue to preach the word and to get out there and help people that are Black who are living with MS to know that it is possible to live well. I appreciate your insight and your personality, and hopefully you and I will stay in touch so we can keep spreading the word.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sheila. Every time I see these sorts of things coming from you, I'm astounded at how much of the experience, like the Black experience, things that run through my veins, you have in a PowerPoint deck, and things that sort of seem evident to me or evident to the people around me, you have made very plain and able to be digested by people who are not of the culture. And that's very important. People cannot thread the needle. You do that very well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right. We're going to go on and finish up so we can get some questions from our audience. Dr. Osler, one of the founders of Johns Hopkins, really summed it up in terms of how I approach looking at communities of color. It's more important to know what patient has the disease than what disease the patient has. Once you find out the Black experience of living with MS, the treatment regimen, the lifestyle changes, and all that you need and resources to live well fall into place. Next slide. And quite frankly, the Human Genome Project definitely put out of the discussion the differences in races. We are all more alike than different. 99% of us are similar in terms of our genetic makeup. It's not about race. Clearly, we need to focus more on the human race and understand how we can be supportive, how we can have systems that will support and encourage people with living with MS to live a quality life. Next slide. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, as I began this discussion, anthropologically, we are all Africans. That's the cradle of civilization. That's where it all began. And different migrations to different parts of the world produce less melanin, produce difference in hair texture, difference in eye color, but we all started at the same place. You may not like hearing that, but that's the scientific fact. Next slide. And I want to end our discussion today with a song. And this is a song called Lift Every Voice and Sing. It was written by two African-American men, John Desmond Weldon and James Weldon, two civil rights icons, two men who thought clearly about the history of Blacks in America, and they chronicled it in a song. This song is now deemed the Black national anthem. I want you to hear it. We're only going to do one verse. It's 3 verses, but if you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can Google it online.
With the harmonies like this part right here. Come on.
Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on.
Let us march on.
Till victory is won.
Now we add a little something to it. Just encourage it. We're gonna take it to church later. Let's go.
We'll keep marching, fighting till the victory is won.
To all my brothers out there.
Hold your head up, brother, till the victory is won.
To all my sisters in the struggle.
Keep believing, sister, till the victory is won.
Till that day.
Till that day comes.
Hey,
Let us march on
to victory.
till victory is won. Is won.
Hopefully, when you go online, you can get a better rendition of that. I think you'll enjoy reading it. It's inspirational, it's uplifting. And as Maya Angelou said, it's time to step off the road and cut a brand new path. It's time that we as clinicians, industry leaders, people living with MS, patient advocates, all need to come together to make sure that people who are Black or of African heritage can live well with MS. This presentation is not the end, it's the beginning. I hope we've inspired you to look further into what you can do, what role you can play in supporting and acknowledging and addressing the Black experience in America and the Black experience of living with MS. Next slide. So, is it possible to live well with MS? Yes, you can. Damian has showed us that, and there are many probably examples that are listening to this webinar that can show you that as well. Clearly, we are at a time in this country when quality, affordable, accessible, culturally competent, equitable healthcare is not a privilege, it's a civil right. Thank you so much for your attention.
Sheila, thank you so much. This has been incredibly powerful and just tremendous. And we are so grateful for this presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure, Jennifer. Always a pleasure to work with you. You're one of the people I call that are in my club of people who get it. Okay? You're a sister from another mister. So I thank you for your heart and your passion and your commitment with MS Views and News. And my greetings to all of you. I wish you all well. Be well, stay safe, and let's come together. We may have come here in different boats, but we're in the same boat now. Let's fix this.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Sheila. And I do have some questions from our audience, and I want to let our audience know that if you'd like to ask Sheila a question, we have the question box on this. You should see it on your screen. There's an arrow, a little orange arrow that's on the side. And if you click on that arrow and you click on questions, you can type these questions in. I can see them and relay them to Sheila as you type. So I'm going to just ask you a few questions, Sheila.
Okay.
I have someone, Anita is writing, and she asks, how can I get my doctor to listen more to me when I'm at a visit?
I hear that all the time, not only with Black people living with MS, but with other conditions as well. Unfortunately, the system is too often dismissive of people. And I would say that insist upon listening, insist upon the attention. And if your doctor seems rushed and can't give you the quality of time, I often suggest to my clients, ask him, when can I come back when you have more time to talk to me? I have some serious issues that I'd like to share with you, and you seem busy today. If you do that a few times and there's no response, I'd get another doctor.
Exactly. And, I always remind people living with MS or any patient that you're not married to your doctor.
That's
and
right.
You can always move on and find another,
Exactly.
Especially today with telehealth options also.
Exactly.
Even
You must demand quality health. Anything less is unacceptable.
Yes. And I have similar in the communication. As a care partner, how can I communicate better with my wife's physician?
Oh, as a care partner. Oh, that's a
As a
good
care
question.
partner. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's the same scenario, Jennifer. I think it's making sure that the provider understands that you are there to support and assist. And unless you have the time to talk to me about this, we'll have to find where we can find somebody who gives you the time. Make it clear at the beginning. I'm not an afterthought. I'm not just an appendage. I'm partnering. I'm part of this dialogue, this shared decision making. And you must give me the time, or else I'll find somebody who can, whether it's an NP, a PA, a medical social worker. Pull in the patient providers that are available to support you in that effort.
Yeah, yes, I agree. And it's very important to feel embraced in the setting that you're receiving your health care, and to know that you can bring your partner or your daughter or your son or someone that's going to be able to support you through that visit. And know that that's allowed, and that's a total possibility. And if that office doesn't embrace that model, then you can find another office that
And quite frankly, in the Black community, it may be a non-blood relative. It may be a close friend. It may be a neighbor, which is often the case, extended family. So anybody that's there to be your voice and to be an assistant, an insistent voice that doesn't give up.
Excellent. Excellent. Let me see here what else we have coming in, Sheila. Mom Harper, in simple language, what's the key differences in race and ethnicity?
Race, as I said a few times in the presentation, is a social construct. That's a way that people have decided to bucket humankind. Ethnicity is how people come together with race, religion, nationality, or language. That's the more appropriate term, how to group people by religion, language, country of origin, and nationality. Race/ethnicity is often seen in the literature. Race is physical characteristics. That's it. Hair color, eye shape, color of my skin, hair texture, all of that. That's race. Doesn't mean anything biological or scientific. Those labels were imposed upon people. We didn't choose to be called Black or African American. We didn't choose to be called Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. Those were imposed. It's ethnicity, language, religion, country of national origin, and race.
Okay, thank you. I have Wanda is writing in. Oh, Mom Harper says thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Wanda's writing in. How can I get my medical professional to not always blame every pain that I experience on just MS? So
Yeah, again, it's that dialogue with the provider and being very clear about what you are feeling and how you're going to deal with that. It's really being insistent and being even aggressive to make sure that don't dismiss me, don't say that it's this. I really want to find out what's going on here. It's, again, repetitive insistence about demanding the right answers. It's something that you just have to keep doing. And again, if you keep doing it too long, go someplace else. I know that's not easy. That sounds easy. It's challenging, but I think that's where you have to go if you really want to take charge of your own health. You have to own your role as your own advocate.
Excellent. Thank you. Tremendous amounts of thank yous, of gratitude for today's program. And I get this in our last program and a lot today. What can I do to help? A lot of people ask, what can I do to make a change?
Well, I think it's first establishing the commitment to make a change. And you have to figure out what role you can play in that patient journey. Are you in policy? Are you in a facility where you can create change and ensure that cultural competency is a part of the education of providers? Are you in a position to be focused on one patient or a group of patients? You got to figure out where you have your best fit and what you bring to the table to be a voice for them, to be a supporter, to be clearly somebody that's encouraging. It just depends. You've got to figure that out. We each have a role to play. Find out what it is, own it, and be consistent with it in your geographic area, in your healthcare facility, in your community. find out what your role can be and consistently stick with it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have so many questions coming in for you. Let me see here. Sheila, Jennifer, I'm an MS warrior in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis. An advocate for the National MS Society. I encourage people of color to look for support groups. There is one in the Minneapolis area that I've attended. It's welcoming. I feel informed and willing to share experiences. I happen to be, other than a person of color with several brothers and other mothers, and listening to this webinar was an obligation for me to understand. So thank you.
Well, let me make a comment about something she said. When she said you have to look for groups, I think groups have to look for Black people. They're not necessarily going to take the first step. So if there's a church, if there's a community-based organization in your community that you know is predominantly assembling Black people together, put yourself in their shoes. They may not necessarily come to you or feel comfortable coming to you. You've got to reach out to them and find the places where they are. Jennifer, you and I have talked about doing work in beauty salons and barbershops and nail salons. Meet the community where they're at. Don't wait, because of life stuff, they may not reach out and they may be hesitant to reach out, especially if there aren't anybody there that looks like them. So intent is good, but you may often have to take the first step and engage and welcome and make sure that this diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a part of you taking the first step.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate tonight. I do have to wrap it up, but I want to say thank you again. This has just been completely powerful. At one point you had me in tears. And I just think it's wonderful work that you do. And as Damian stated, it's just the way that you put it in a PowerPoint for everyone to really understand it and feel it is so powerful. Thank you for this work.
Well, you're very welcome, Jennifer. One of my pastor friends tells me I'm doing the Lord's work. So I'm hoping that he's with me and helping me to say what will make sense to people and encourage and enlighten people, because I do feel that we have the power to make a difference. We just need to know how to do it. We know why, but we need to just do it. We can do it. Thank you so much. And God bless all of you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And I just want to remind everyone that's on with us tonight, you are registered for the entire series with Miss Sheila Thorne. So next month, on April 15th, it'll be another Thursday, and it will be a conversation about the Hispanic and Latino experience living with multiple sclerosis. And we hope that you can all join us. You will be getting a survey. We value your feedback. We'd love to hear what you have to say, what you want to share with us, what you'd love to hear more about. And we read everything that you send us. So thank you. And we hope to see you again next month.
Thank you, Jennifer. See you in April. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.